And so it's my pleasure to introduce the speaker, Carlos Montemayor, for our first speaker of the year for this series. Carlos is based at the University of San Francisco. I was going to San Diego. San Francisco. He works in philosophy of mind, epistemology. His work also touches on cognitive science. And so today he's going to talk about the difference between consciousness and attention. So,
thank you very much. Well, thank you very much for coming. And thank you for the invitation, and Deborah for organizing everything. The notions of consciousness and attention, I mean, some people that are working on intelligence or rationality, they seem to focus more on traditional research on attention. And in one recent paper by the DeepMind team, they say, there's been 150 years of science on attention. And that really is different with respect to consciousness. Consciousness wasn't really discussed, as all of you know. And it wasn't until people started focusing on the notion of phenomenal consciousness or awareness, or the blueness of blue, or the bitterness of lemon, or the painfulness of pain, that kind of thing, the bracketing of the experience itself as having content, that people started isolating the notion of consciousness from other notions. And one thing that I want to talk about today is that a lot of work remains to be done with respect to what is the relationship between the debate on consciousness and the long-standing debate on the nature of attention. It's a pretty open field. So I'm going to try to talk about the motivation for distinguishing consciousness and attention. I'm going to talk about why is it that almost all theories of consciousness entail a very dramatic difference between phenomenal consciousness and attention. And then I'll motivate more this distinction through considerations about evolution, language, time, memory, and the senses. That's a lot, but hopefully you will see what I mean by this. Okay, so where to start? Nagel is a good place to start, because Nagel, in his now almost 50-year-old paper in 1974, What is it like to be a bat? First asked this question pretty pointedly and dramatically. Can there be a science of consciousness, right, in general? Obviously, those of you who are familiar with this paper, which is almost all students of philosophy are familiar with this paper, Nagel is very skeptical in the paper about this, but he's hesitant to go all the way towards dualism. Okay, so he says, we can't even conceive of any way of doing a science of consciousness. That's because we have no way of determining what is a first-person perspective. But I'm a physicalist. That's the thing he says towards the end of the paper. I don't want to commit to any view that says that we need to revise our notions of consciousness because we have no idea how to develop a science of consciousness. So he says, can there be a science of consciousness? Not that we can conceive of, but in principle, maybe yes. And Chalmers, obviously, in the 1995 paper, after the hard problem of consciousness paper, this is actually in a 2001 paper, says that's an unstable view because it's almost dogmatic. It's like saying, I have no idea how to study consciousness, but because I have a lot of faith in physicalism, my argument is, based on my faith, I need to accept physicalism. And Chalmers, for the first time, says, actually, the dualist views make more sense. So that's kind of like how it started. And what I want to suggest today is that all this debate is very interesting, but it has kept the field in a very standoffish situation, where the question is still relevant. Can there be a science of consciousness? Everyone is interested in this question, but the emphasis is always on how awfully difficult it is to approach consciousness in any way. And what I want to suggest today is that studying attention carefully and studying what people have said about phenomenal consciousness is probably one of the most fruitful ways of developing a science of consciousness. I'm not going to solve the hard problem today. I'm not going to tell you that consciousness is this or that. physical phenomenon. I'm going to talk about a very well-studied phenomenon, attention, that people understand very well in psychophysics, and explain why that has to be relevant to our science of consciousness. Okay. So one of the questions that relates to can there be a science of consciousness is, well, if there is the possibility, and I think we all hope there is going to be the possibility of developing a science of consciousness, one key question is, how is consciousness different from other components of the mind? Because even though there's a lot of debate about what is the nature of consciousness, the metaphysical nature of consciousness, everyone agrees that it's a mental phenomenon. No one says, consciousness is a fundamental thing in the universe, I'm a panpsychist, but that has nothing to do with the mind. No one has ever said that. Right? So as a component of the mind, how is consciousness different from other components of the mind? The metaphysical question is what exactly consciousness is. As I said, that question has been asked a lot. One way of illuminating that is to distinguish consciousness from other components of the mind. And one thing I want to suggest is that the difference between consciousness and other mental phenomena, including attention, is that consciousness has specific kind of value, and that this can give us some insight into what it is eventually. Okay? That's just with respect to the debate as a whole, right? The standoff we are at now, where no one really wants to tackle the question directly of how to develop science of consciousness. There's this issue of value, and then methodologically, it would be good, and this is again something I think most people agree about, at least definitely everyone in psychology agrees about this. Maybe understanding consciousness through something we understand a lot better is a good methodological strategy, so maybe we should look at attention. Okay, so I am now just going to establish a bunch of facts. Okay, so this is not specifically my view, but this is just kind of like the situation now in the debate on consciousness and attention. Okay? So the consensus view, with very few exceptions, even the exceptions are not really exceptions to this, is that attention is necessary for consciousness. Tons of people believe this. And it would be, for several reasons, interesting to argue the opposite, that consciousness is necessary for attention. But at least in psychology, this is a very common view. And so here are a few examples of major theories of consciousness. I think this is almost comprehensive. This is almost a comprehensive list. So for example, consciousness is previously processed or attended to information that is broadcast in a neural global workspace. That's the global neuronal workspace theory by Stan Dehane, Bernard Bars, and all these researchers, mostly in Europe, that argue, yes, of course, whatever happens before information is broadcast into the global network, it has to be attended to somehow. And they're perfectly happy with notions of highly complex ways of unconscious attention, even to linguistic stimuli. Here's another popular definition. Consciousness is integrated information, irreducible to component parts in which information is partially processed or attended to. This is not exactly the way they put it, but obviously this is Giulio Tononi's view of integrated information theory. He has the phi measure to distinguish conscious processing from other type of conscious processing, but talking to him and other people associated with his team, they're perfectly happy with the idea that attention has to play a more fundamental role, maybe not the integrated information role, but so there you have it. That view is compatible with the consensus view that attention is necessary for consciousness. The higher order theory. Consciousness is information or representations or contents attended to at the first, that are attended to at the first order level, that are embedded in a higher order representation. Higher order representation in terms of higher order disposition or higher order linguistic representation of the different versions of the higher order theory. But again, you have the commitment that the first order level is a level of content processing, where attention definitely plays a role, because attention is selection for further processing that is content involving, right? Selection of content. A separate question is what exactly attention is, but you will see that this is kind of neutral with respect to that. And then there's the so-called first order theory of conscious awareness, reentrant information. Consciousness is reentrant information required for conscious awareness that necessarily requires also some degree of attention. This is a debate. This is a little bit more controversial than the rest, but even in this view, most of these researchers, this is, for example, a view that Ned Block has defended. Ned Block is perfectly happy with the distinction between attention and consciousness. Actually, he introduced a distinction where, if you think about it, the distinction between phenomenal consciousness and access consciousness is a way of justifying cross-modal modes of attention from phenomenal consciousness. So that's just to establish the fact that all these views that are the major views on consciousness, of course, there are the metaphysical views, there's dualism, physicalism, panpsychism, and all that, but the views about like what consciousness is in terms of information, these are the views, and they all allow for attention. They all entail a way, or there's a way of showing that attention is necessary for consciousness. So that, I mean, if you think about these criteria, that really justifies that methodologically we should understand very well attention, and not only that, but understand how attention relates to consciousness. That's really going to be fundamental for a scientific theory of consciousness. Clue, all the scientific theories of consciousness entail something like this. Okay, so I mean, something interesting about integrated information theory is they, instead of, I'm going to say something about this in a few slides above, but instead of starting with a notion of access consciousness, they presuppose phenomenal consciousness as the main notion of consciousness from the very get-go. But even then, they assume that there's a distinction between consciousness and attention. Okay, so there's a weak way of understanding this claim, namely that consciousness is fully dissociated from attention. The claim, that consciousness is fully dissociated from attention, they have nothing to do with one another, is unsupported, but that the dissociation may come in degrees. And in a co-author book, my co-author and I explored several versions of these relations between consciousness and attention, and what it means to have views where attention only affects certain types of conscious awareness and so on. A stronger claim is that the full dissociation from attention is actually incoherent. To claim that consciousness, phenomenal consciousness, is absolutely fully dissociated from any kind of attention, that claim is almost a priori contradictory or inconceivable. Because it would be something like phenomenal consciousness. If it's fully dissociated from attention, we can conceive of a form of phenomenal consciousness that has no content that has been selected for, and that would violate something like Brentano's principle, that all mental representation has content, or that is intentional. So that's something to think about. But so here are a few puzzles about this dependence or constitutive relation between attention and consciousness. Here's one. If consciousness is essentially dependent on attention, then why cannot we define it functionally? I mean, that's the hard problem, right? The hard problem is we cannot define phenomenal consciousness functionally, so that's very, very hard. That's puzzling given the dependence on phenomenal consciousness on attention. I mean, and Chalmers and everyone who talks about this noticed this, but I don't think people have thought about this very carefully in the context of attention research. Okay. They've thought about it in the metaphysical mode of operating in the literature, but not really in terms of what it means when you talk about attention and content. And there are some interesting problems here about just what kind of situation a zombie scenario is. Because there the dependency is between natural facts and phenomenal facts. But then there's another story that needs to be told about being in a state with phenomenal facts that are about something and your behavior. And how are those going to look when you're not only thinking about the relationship between the physical world and the phenomenal world, but about the phenomenal world's impact on your actions and behavior. That has to be spelled out a little bit in functional terms, and that hasn't been done. Okay, so if the strong claim is taken at face value, then the hard problem should be incoherent, right? Because we just said that it's incoherent, according to the strong interpretation, it's incoherent to think of phenomenal consciousness without any relationship to any form of attention. Think about spatial navigation. So you look at the way you navigate space, and you have your phenomenology of space is three-dimensional. There's a dimension of time. You have a phenomenology of time. And imagine someone comes and says, like that phenomenology you have has nothing to do with what you're paying attention to in space. That sounds close to incoherent, right? Because you're paying attention to the fact that space has three dimensions. You're paying spatial attention to certain orientations. You're paying attention to the duration of events. You're paying attention to what's simultaneous and what's not simultaneous, and so on. But that now it really is puzzling, because obviously a lot of people think that the hard problem is not only coherent, but a major problem, the major roadblock in developing a science of consciousness. So I think framing the issue between functionalist approaches and phenomenal consciousness in terms of attention changes the flavor of the hard problem, or at least changes the way in which one has to think about the hard problem. Now, most definitions of attention, and this is interesting, all the very recent work on attention that started roughly around 5 to 10 years, is extremely scientifically informed. These guys pay very close attention, no pun intended, to the scientific literature, and use the scientific literature to develop their views. And again, as I was saying, the science on attention is really old. And this is not like the replication bias, oh my God, psychology is collapsing. These are extremely well replicated experiments. This is as good as scientific psychology gets. All the research on bottom-up attention and attention for navigation and so on. But in all these definitions, attention is defined functionally somehow. So a functional definition of attention is always at play when people think about the nature of attention. There's the very broad general characterization of attention that people use, and we explain it in this co-author book of 2015, that attention is, at the very least, the selection of content, the very precise, sensitive selection of content for further processing. What has been spelled out recently in philosophy is what is this further processing about. So there's Wayne Wu's view that attention is selection for action, that actually selection is a form of agency. We're manifesting our agency when we act mentally through attention, and that attention is this kind of mental agency. Or it is selection for cognitive processing. In general, that's the one I was describing, or selection by a subject. That's another popular view about attention. Unified or coordinated information, that's Chris Moll's definition. And there are other definitions, salience and so on, but they all heavily involve selection, they all heavily involve some function, essential function of attention. And this information processing is never left sort of undefined or spookily conceived. It's always information processing from input to output. Information processing that is kind of mathematically treatable. And gives selection and guidance in the processing. Okay. So, as you know, the hard problem is that consciousness cannot be functionally defined. So solving the problems of how attention works and what it is, what attention is, or the so-called metaphysical problem are easy problems. According to the hard problem, attention really is not interesting metaphysically. But what I'm trying to suggest is maybe even if one accepts that that's true, let's suppose that's true. I mean, there's all things to debate about this. But even assuming that this is true, that doesn't mean that methodologically attention is not necessary. Some kind of methodological necessity is attention needs to be understood very clearly to know like how consciousness is informative, for example. And that is not, I mean, saying that it's an easy problem is not going to help here. So another puzzling thing about this way of looking at things is that access to information, which is what attention affords, in all the forms of attention, according to the hard problem, are going to be insufficient to capture what it's like to be in a phenomenal conscious state. But this sounds, again, on the face of it, completely implausible, because obviously what I'm paying attention to has to specify in some pretty fundamental way what my experience is like. So if the idea is that all the problems of attention are easy and the hard problem is this really mega problem, but that if that's interpreted as anything about attention is going to be irrelevant in our science of consciousness, that on the face of it is this claim that sounds just not plausible. And according to phenomenalist views, intentionalist phenomenalist views, but just phenomenalist views that appeal, for example, Chalmers' interpretation of the two-dimensional semantics, even the way consciousness is unified cannot be captured by the selective processes of attention. But again, that is a little bit puzzling if you think about even the spatial case. But this is a little bit more debatable. Now, if you think about theories of information, things get a lot more puzzling. And someone who pointed this out very clearly was David Lewis in his 1988 quasi-defense of Frank Jackson's Mary thought experiment, where he defends the thought experiment a bunch of misinterpretations, but then at the end it says it just doesn't make any sense in terms of information theory. The information gets more and more and more puzzling. He calls it curiouser and curiouser. That's one of the sections of the paper. So, and here is the puzzle. Some kind of information is necessary to understand phenomenal information. I think very few people, I have not seen a single person that says consciousness is not informative. So for the science of consciousness, we need to understand how is it that consciousness is informative, phenomenal consciousness. But the problem is that the notion of phenomenal information truly is perplexing. And again, I recommend Lewis's paper here. So now let's go through a list of definitions of what information is. Okay, these are just broad, definitions. There's the Shannonian definition that it's, according to Shannon, it was just a constraint on communication. It's not a theory of information that you could use, for example, in semantics. But again, that definition is very useful. It is very instructive in many contexts. It's completely inapplicable to phenomenal consciousness the way we define it, because it's not only relational and functional, it's completely extrinsic. It's an imposed metric on an informational process. How about semantic notions, the qualitative information contained in conscious awareness? Well, unless you are antecedently committed to a very specific interpretation of the two-dimensional semantics, namely David Chalmers's, there is no reason to think that a semantics for qualitative information needs to be internalist. And for example, you can be like Robert Stalnaker and think, no, this is fully determined by the environment and the external situations, or at least you can see that it's compatible with some form of externalism, so it doesn't mean that it has to be necessarily phenomenal. Okay. So looking here is not going to fully dispelling the mystery of how exactly phenomenal consciousness is informative, because you have at least two options. How about it being indexical? Okay, so David Lewis already says that in his paper that this is not really necessary to understand phenomenal consciousness, and Perry, of course, also disagrees that it has to be internal, some kind of like internal indexical. So that's also not going to solve the problem. And again, we're looking for a scientific view of this. So basically, no scientific theory of information, and I'm omitting a lot about like causal theories of information and information theory that is based on Bayesian decision making and so on. But none of those theories really entails something like the non-functional definability of phenomenal consciousness. The only theory that takes it at face value and says phenomenal consciousness cannot be reduced to any relational metric or information, but then they define it in terms of metric, is the integrated information theory, and they don't argue for it, they take it as an axiom, okay? That phenomenal consciousness is not reducible. Okay. So now we have the situation where if we're trying to develop a science of consciousness, we really probably should start asking questions like, well, maybe the metaphysical questions need to be informed because of the reasons concerning methodology that I expressed at the beginning of the paper. Maybe they need to be informed by this dependency between phenomenal consciousness and attention. We need to know a lot more about that. And we need to know what happens to information that is attended to that changes so dramatically when it becomes phenomenally conscious. And maybe one of the questions that we should be asking is, instead of asking just how the universe needs to be put together in order for it to accommodate phenomenal consciousness, maybe we should ask, well, what is it that consciousness does when we have it, phenomenal consciousness? What aspects of our life, mental life, change dramatically because we're phenomenally conscious and not just paying attention? I think this is a very important question. So of course we can have different models and so on, but one of the really interesting possibilities here is that the main difference between phenomenal consciousness and attention is the value of attention probably is highly epistemic. It allows us to do a lot of things. It provides justification for beliefs. It allows us to know things about the environment. The value of phenomenal consciousness might be different. And then the question is, what could it be? We know it's associated with moral value. We know that we associate moral value with a creature being phenomenally conscious. That's a clue, that's a hint, but I think we should ask this question much more seriously. What is the relationship between attention, consciousness, intelligence, and rationality? So there's views that say, if you're not phenomenally conscious, you cannot be rational. Okay, what if I'm access conscious? Well, I don't like the distinction between access and phenomenal. Well, so why is it that I cannot be rational or have intelligence if there's no way of comparing what it's like to me with what it's like to be you, and then the thing remains undecidable? So maybe we need to think not only of like one sort of natural kind distinction between attention and phenomenal consciousness. Maybe we want to think about a variety of ways in which some kinds of phenomenal consciousness and attention relate to intelligence or rationality, maybe not. But so this is one rich area of research that should be explored. Now here is one thing where this is my view. So far I've been telling you what's the status of the debate, what people think in psychology, what people think in neuroscience, what people think in philosophy, why everything they say suggests that there is a massive difference between consciousness and attention. How to solve it, I've been giving you some ideas that other people have. Now, my view is that evolution is something that really should matter here in this debate. The evolution of attention. And whatever evolutionary story will come up for consciousness. Okay, so here is a very not... I'm not super happy with this chart. It's in a book from 2015. You can imagine it the way some evolutionary biologists imagine it, just a sort of projected circle from ancient species to new species, and we're just like one point on the circle. So there's no linearity of evolution. We're not more evolved than anyone else, any other species. But this is useful in terms of time. Okay, so kind of like the kind of thing that probably evolved first doesn't mean that it's less evolved. It doesn't mean that it's less complex. It only means if you don't have this, you cannot even become a predator in the Cambrian explosion. Right? So once you have this, you can do other things. But these are like really primitive. Forget about signal detection, but very, very, very basic sensory receptors that are selective. Feature-based attention seems to be really, really fundamental. And object-based attention, I know that there's a debate. You can be an object-based attention bottom-up person or a feature-based attention. There's a debate between Treisman and Polishin, for example. But these are like super basic forms of attention that presumably have an impact on our phenomenology. And then you get more complicated things. You get more egocentric, proprioceptive forms of attention, theory of mind, the monitoring of other species, and your conspecifics. A distinction that probably evolves later is a distinction I'm going to say something about. This is the only charts that I drew on the board. I promise I won't draw anything else because I'm really terrible at that. But the distinction between voluntary and effortful and involuntary attention, overt and covert, multimodal integration of attention, these seem to be much more complicated forms of attention than just the basic navigational capacities. And the idea is we can't tell, not, by the way, interestingly, not a lot of people have written on the evolution of attention. The usual suspects, Tubia and Cosmides, have one of the earliest papers on the evolution of attention. But you can't tell the story. I mean, all I'm saying is it's not super hard to imagine, yeah, you know, these forms of attention really are adaptive. You need them in these environments. They have this kind of impact on your behavior, and so on. Now, consciousness, again, it depends on how you define it, but here things get kind of complicated and interesting. So you have Bloch's distinction between access and phenomenal. We're focusing on phenomenal because I think that's where the division is, phenomenal consciousness and attention. You can think of attention as some form of multimodal integration that is access consciousness or access conscious. You don't have to, but I think that's a plausible way of looking at things. But here you have these two distinctions. Then you have conscious integration, or what some authors call subsumption. You have self-awareness, language, and mind reading. In some views of phenomenal consciousness, these play a major role. In many views, they don't play any role, but at least we know language might have a big impact on our phenomenal consciousness or access consciousness. These are questions that we should be asking. Obviously, evolutionary speaking, giving a story about mind reading is way easier than giving a story about the evolution of language. Although, of course, there's people working on this. So that's the idea. That would be kind of like the story about attention, the story about consciousness, and then something like the story about the relationship. Like, what kind of contributions, functional contributions and attention may have that unless you have this interaction, you don't have these other forms of conscious attention. Like, for example, a personal narrative, right? So maybe we can't have autobiographical memory. We're going to see in a second some justification for that, unless you have an interaction between some forms of attention and some forms of phenomenal consciousness. But again, this is just speculative. It's sort of like what it would look like to start developing this framework to better define phenomenal consciousness and access consciousness in a scientific way. So I think people in psychology are aware about how important it is to compare our cognitive capacities to other species. And I think that is a very important constraint in the development of a science of consciousness in this way. So that's... here are other things that I kind of said, but I will go through them anyway, because there's more specific claims here. So I think it's uncontroversial to say that different forms of attention evolve at different times. So our how we pay attention to a mathematical equation is not probably something that evolved in the Cambrian explosion. Some types of attention, because of this difference, might be fully dissociated from some types of phenomenal consciousness. An interesting claim is, an interesting issue here is when exactly can we tell that phenomenal consciousness emerged? And it could be that all types of attention are necessary for consciousness. It wouldn't, I mean, this claim needs to be qualified. It wouldn't mean that all species will be phenomenally conscious, but it would definitely mean that they have the capacity of being conscious, maybe not the way we are, but that they have the wherewithal. And then, again, the issue of information and functionality, functionalism. Okay, so here's a different approach that has to do with the kind of thing attention is, what kind of access to content it affords, what animals can do with it, and the fact that these are experimentally measurable things. They're not mysterious things. Okay, so if you think about what gives phenomenal consciousness epistemic status, it's something like the contents of phenomenal consciousness. And many people, I think, intuitively claim or think that this is why attention is necessary. Okay. A way of resolving what are the contents of my mental state right now is what we can jointly attend to, what we can jointly point at. So if I say this is a table, this is gray, you say no, I disagree, that's not. We're talking about something that obviously is publicly accessible, but also where our attention is selective in a similar way. We very rarely point at how we feel when we do this kind of thing. So one of the claims here, I mean, and again, this is something this is something I believe. This is not at all the status of the field. Actually, here, I think a more popular view is the view that if you're not phenomenally conscious, you cannot have forms of intentionality or forms of rationality. This is kind of like the inverse claim. If you distinguish phenomenally conscious awareness from attention, and you ask the question, what gives your consciousness epistemic status, that means status of justified belief or knowledge, it is that we can enable joint attention through our experience. Right? So it's not the experience itself that allows us to do this, it's how that experience allows us to jointly attend to the same things. I mean, at least that's the claim. So one question here, and this is, again, quite a bit more controversial, is that the epistemic functions of consciousness, the epistemic functions of phenomenal consciousness, are the ones that are dependent on attention. That it's when it comes to knowledge, justified belief, testimony, even just belief formation, that's where phenomenal consciousness really truly depends on attention. And what kind of impact phenomenal consciousness is going to have on our lives may depend on other things like the moral or aesthetic value of our experiences. I don't want to get too much into the aesthetic territory, but Nick Humphrey has this view. Nicholas Humphrey thinks that what the difference consciousness makes in our lives is not really epistemic. It's a different kind of value. It has to do with our moral status and the aesthetic value of our experiences. Okay, so in any case, these are just some ways of understanding this difference, but it seems that in general, it is useful to think of these contrasts between epistemic value and other types of value, between different types of evolution, in terms of a framework for the decision between consciousness and attention. So I'm not saying that thinking in terms of the framework that dissociates consciousness and attention entails something like the claim that phenomenal consciousness has no value, that is epistemic, but at least is one of the possibilities it raises. If you think about the impact of language on phenomenal consciousness, here too, it seems that cannot happen without attention playing a pretty fundamental role. So you can think of attention as different types of abilities or attention skills, attention to contents. And the contents, again, in most communicative settings are publicly accessible to all speakers or all the creatures interacting in communication. And here you find something interesting that many authors, well, not many, but quite a few authors, John Campbell, Donald Davidson, and in psychology, Michael Tomasello, think that unless you can have forms of joint attention, so now this is not just attention that is selective to certain contents that allow you to justify beliefs, like there's an apple in front of me and so on, but actually a type of attention that is jointly structured and sort of necessarily exercised with others, that unless you have that, you cannot have certain types of reference or certain type. I mean, John Campbell says unless you have attention, you cannot have demonstrative reference in semantics. But probably you wouldn't have strong communication abilities if you didn't have this capacity to jointly attend. So again, even if you think about the relationship between language and consciousness, it seems that there you will find this dependency again, and contemporary ways of looking at how phenomenal consciousness acquires semantic content may have to be considered, they have to be evaluated or re-evaluated in this way. This is something that I like. I don't know how relevant it is. I'm just going to read it. It's Thomas Reith talking about knowledge. Says, let's suppose, since it plainly appears to be possible that our eyes have been so framed as to suggest the position of the object without suggesting any quality, what is the consequence of this supposition? That the person endued with such an eye would perceive the visible figures without having sensations. Okay. And you can say, well, that's weird. But as long as you have a capacity to jointly be informed by the same content, the appearance of a specific way it feels to you is not going to play a fundamental role. It's going to play a fundamental role in introspection, in your evaluation of other things, but not a fundamental role in being related to a content that is communicable. Okay, so this is a little bit more controversial, or quite a bit more controversial. We've said that so the hard problem is that phenomenal consciousness cannot be studied functionally. So, and many people say we need to take the hard problem seriously. People have said if we take the hard problem seriously, we need to be dualist or something like that. I think that if you take the hard problem seriously, given this framework, the consequence is there's no epistemic value to consciousness, because typically epistemic value is something that you can define functionally through some functions like attention. By the way, the focus in the literature on intelligence is entirely on very early forms of attention. They never even mention phenomenal consciousness. It's a paper by Lego et al. So neither language nor attention routines are ineffable in the sense that they cannot be functionally defined. Actually, it's a constraint on forms of attention that they can. So maybe taking the hard problem seriously just means when you take the problem of what makes it different from a normative perspective seriously. Okay, I'm kind of running out of time, but you can give a similar story. This is a paper with my same co-author, 2017, about the evolution of intentionality. So you can, just like you, imagine like someone asked Brentano, okay, Brentano, this is great. You just said that mental content, the mark of the mental is that they're all intentional, they're all about something. How did that evolve? If you want to give that answer, you're very likely to give an answer that looks a lot like the evolution of attention. So for example, some forms of intentionality are going to be architecturally conceived as encapsulated or as very early or bottom up. You will have to use the language of objects or features. You're going to have to connect this to some kind of attention routine because these features or objects are perceived through these attention selective processes. And that will be your theory of intentionality. Now, if you ask Brentano, okay, that was very neat, but what about consciousness? How did consciousness evolve? Either you repeat the same story or it's just going to look arbitrary. And if you look at the literature, it's pretty arbitrary. People go from the Cambrian periods to very, very recent evolutionary traits. Maybe just animals, maybe just higher mammals. Some people like octopuses, so the octopi or octopus. that they're conscious according to some people. Some people think bees are conscious because they have this navigational frame. It's very out there. There's kind of like not a homogeneous story to tell. So again, another reason to think that there is a very big difference here, and that what attention is doing is giving you the wherewithal for epistemic appraisal and semantic appraisal, and whatever the contribution of consciousness is different. This is just a cute little thing, the Homer thing, Homo sapien. There's nothing to do with what I just said, but the theories that you will have to give for the evolution will have to be functional in some way. And here, the only point I want to emphasize is that it is possible to give that story when you talk about attention. It's just it's not that it's impossible. Obviously, it's not impossible to give it about consciousness, but the story is very different and a lot more arbitrary, and a lot less constrained or restricted. It's more about like what do you think is relevant given some factor that is difficult to spell out in this way. So this is a little bit more about the evolution of attention. Again, these are some of the things that are interesting. You can measure very precisely how insects, for example, pay attention to objects or features, how smart or how intelligent they are. One question is, how are those forms of paying attention related to consciousness? Perhaps they're related to consciousness, but maybe these early forms of attention are not necessary for phenomenal consciousness. The only way you can understand this claim is by dissociating phenomenal consciousness from attention. So that's just another illustration here. This is a little bit repetitive. Here, the one thing I want to emphasize is, well, as you can see, the criteria are more sort of widespread, if you want to call it. So there's the involvement of the thalamus. I mean, so there's a lot of people in neuroscience that say the corticothalamic region is really what is necessary for phenomenal consciousness. You switch that off, you become comatose. Well, that's fine. That doesn't give me a lot of clues about how exactly this evolved or what it's doing. There's widespread activity. Okay, so that's the global workspace, reportability, and so on. There's the dependency of language. So there's people that say phenomenal consciousness could not have possibly evolved unless you have the language capacity. Here a problem is some authors, prominent authors, think the language capacity is uniquely human. Okay. Not communication, but language as a syntactic, compositional, formal capacity is uniquely human. And there's plenty of experiments that suggest that this is the case. So again, interesting problems when you think about the evolution of consciousness and attention. Okay, so now in what I have left, I don't want to go beyond the hour, but I just want to show what could this mean if you look at different types of perception, different types of cognitive capacities. This distinction between attention and consciousness, this distinction in value between attention and consciousness. So if you look at the literature on time perception, which is pretty big, time perception is something, I mean, if you go like a little bit more fringy, some people attribute this to plants because they're time sensitive in very sophisticated ways. But let's just leave plants aside. Almost all animals have some form of time perception. They have circadian clocks. They have different types of clocks. We're time-sensitive creatures, finite creatures. And many people have claimed all these representations are kind of implicit or unconscious. Husserl says something like this. We have like these motor systems that are pre-conscious. They're not really things we have access through our awareness, and they play a pretty important structural role. Husserl obviously very relevant because he developed a whole theory of what the phenomenology of perception is. Here, all I want to say is that there's a lot of research. This is a paper I wrote in 2017 showing that visceral influence on time estimation based on homeostasis, emotions and sensations, play a limited role, an important role, but a limited role in our overall attentional capacities for time. So you just don't go completely wrong when you're timing something just dependent on your mood. Your mood will have an impact, but it's not going to completely disable your capacity to pay attention to time or to time events. You can make sense of that in terms of a dual processing theory, or in terms of a distinction between agency and pure time perception, similar to the personal subpersonal distinction. And you can even apply it to time. So this is a more recent paper where I argue that the homeostatic visceral influences really have an impact on later forms of time perception, where language also becomes important, just how you narrate certain events to yourself. But the early stages are never really influenced that way. Okay. Early stages where you are figuring out what's simultaneous and what's not simultaneous. So that's one thing where you can see this application. Then about memory, so one thing we say in the book is that one thing that you have when you have phenomenal consciousness, when you're in pain, when you're suffering, when you're hungry, is that you're directly engaged in a much more visceral way than when you're just paying attention. Okay? That probably has a specific kind of value. And the idea is, again, this is another thing I wrote recently, is that also plays a role in your memory capacities. Some things you can remember just by paying attention to them. Psychologists kind of care about this because they have the distinction between episodic and semantic memory, procedural, short-term, long-term memory. And then episodic autobiographical memory that really frames how you experience something in the past. And if you draw this distinction between paying attention to memory in the more neutral way versus the more emotional way, you'll see that there's a lot of literature that seems to justify this distinction between more epistemic ways of remembering and more vivid, personal, morally significant ways of remembering. Okay. This is just weird, so I may just skip this. But one thing I will say is Catherine Talon-Beaudry is an amazing researcher. And one of the things she says about the distinction between consciousness and attention is that the circuits, the sensorial circuits that are associated with awareness, are almost always involved with limbic system activity, or she calls them visceral. I like that word. They're visceral. And here the question is, maybe we can even think of the senses along these lines. Some aspects of vision are more visceral than others. Neuroscientists have discovered that the nervous path, the optic neural path, speaks also not only to the visual areas but to the limbic system. So maybe there's something to this even at the neural level within vision, but you can think of a comparison of senses across this dimension, which are more visceral than others. Obviously, olfaction is notoriously visceral, but this is just speculative. Again, that's all I want to say about this. And then finally, this is just to justify the poster, the very beautiful poster that Deborah created for this talk of the pianist playing. You have a phenomenon that is interesting because of what it suggests about the relationship between consciousness and attention. Caroline Dicey Jennings just wrote a very nice book about attention and the self. And she thinks that you can have attention and this attentive self without phenomenal consciousness. So she has a form of dissociating phenomenal consciousness from attention and from action. So she thinks you can also have action without phenomenal consciousness, but also attention without action. So that's against views like Wayne Wood. So here's the phenomenon. This is the little graph that I was talking about. This is the typical voluntary, effortful attention in serial task where you're looking for Waldo, for example, and you have a very big display. There's tons of little characters. You're looking for Waldo. the more complex the picture and the longer you're subject to this or several of these pictures, the more effort you're going to feel. A boring, sort of something that is kind of in between is like, okay, this is not complicated enough, I'm not feeling a lot of effort, it's also kind of boring. So that's kind of like the idea. Complexity increases effort. Sorry, maybe this should be the other way, that way. But the opposite happens when you have very complex tasks, but you're an expert. So if you're an expert pianist, something very different happens if you're constantly repeating the same piece. You experience effort, but then as complexity goes up, your effort goes down. You completely, I mean, people that have studied this, and if you want to ask questions, I can give you references. They say, I'm no longer there. I kind of lost myself into the experience. I'm in it's called flow, it's the experience of flow. The Russian psychologists call it post-voluntary attention. This is not something that happens to athletes or pianists alone. It happens to mathematicians that, for example, are sitting for 10 hours and someone's like, you haven't eaten lunch or anything. It's like, okay, I probably should do something about that. So it's not only that the effort goes down, it goes down in a pretty dramatic way, in which even the notion of, like, according to this research, self goes away. So that suggests that there are types of experiences where we are paying attention to very complicated things that should reflect on a lot of effort, but for some, probably, presumably, phenomenally conscious reason, namely we're enjoying it, the effort goes down. So this will be an interesting way of showing what is the contribution of phenomenal consciousness to attention, why this kind of experience is interesting, and that's it. Thank you.
Carlos, do you want to take your own questions?
Sure, that's fine.
We have time for questions.
Yes.
Trouble with the axis of
Yeah, they're probably totally wrong.
yeah. If I understand, maybe you mean effortless or would be more on the y-axis, and like I'm not quite sure how to interpret.
Yeah, the idea is that this is, so typically time and complexity, that's the idea. So this is probably very confusing. By the way, this is kind of like one of the ways to illustrate it. But the idea is, in a typical experience, not typical experience, in a typical learning, think of Skinner and these people, right? Reinforced learning or something like that. In a typical learning scenario, the more complex the task and the longer you are in this task, the more effort you're gonna, not only the more effort biologically measurable you'll have, but in particular, the more mental effort you're gonna experience. Right? So that's the typical notion of voluntary effortful attention. What these guys discovered, I mean, there were largely these Russian guys, but also other people, is that here you're clearly paying attention to highly complex things, like, for example, highly complicated mathematical equations that no one would enjoy doing for long periods of time. And biologically, you probably are getting depleted by this activity, but your awareness of what you're doing is absolutely the opposite of effort. So this is it's actually pretty dramatic. This is one of the things that is not just psychophysical. A lot of it is based on interviews and debriefings, but it's incredible how, like, athletes, pianists, high-skilled performers of all sorts of arts, painters, but mathematicians say the same thing. They say, I know that I've been doing this for too long, and this is kind of crazy, but I just don't feel any effort, and I just don't feel even myself when I'm doing this. Actually, the way they describe the experience is, I am no longer there when I'm doing this. It's just not, I just don't think about myself. So that's what this is supposed to, I'm sure this is not. I drew them just because I like the board. But it's probably more confusing than, yeah.
So, I mean, typical example might be a dance performance or somebody working, the mathematics one, I mean, it has to have, I mean, think about that Princeton mathematician who was working on that hard problem all by himself secretly because he didn't want to, and then he finally got it, published it. Well, what I'm worried, think about any of the, okay, take just a dance thing. So we have, first time I ever saw ballet, my wife talked me into coming and seeing Kane and Augustine here in London perform the thing that won the Moscow Ballet Competition
Wow.
in Paris. And I thought, ballet, you know, and wow, I was blown away. But now think about them dancing it. And the consciousness and the attention, it's almost like they're not that conscious about it.
But that's, yes, exactly.
And
So
I want to see how, I'd like to get more of the insight or the clues we're going to get from looking at this
good.
to this problem about consciousness.
Good. So the idea is, if you read what Husserl says about time, unfortunately, I mean, this is a big lecture, but then became a book called On the Phenomenology of Internal Time. One thing he says is we just can't pay attention to the time of all the little events that our actions depend upon, right? So my hand movement, looking at you, having this posture, that involves a lot of timing that there's just no way I can be conscious of that. And he says that is a limit to what grounds our experience of time. And then time has to do with a part of our experience that integrates phenomena in a different way, in a way that he started describing it in a way that extends in time, in a way that retains and projects things. It has a different structure, it's a different beast than just timing. So if you apply that to this, but in a different way, so that's a distinction between consciousness and attention. So we pay attention, this is one thing that is crazy, we pay attention in each modality to time differently. So we have different ways of detecting simultaneity visually than, for example, auditorily. Then that gets integrated. And we're never aware of this asymmetry between vision and audition. But if you think of what's happening here, the way that helps understand what's happening here is that the ballet dancer, if I started training, not that anyone would enjoy that, but if I started training as a ballet dancer, I would experience this. The more complicated the jump or the move or the posture, the more effort I would experience. And the more conscious I will be about what I'm paying attention to. I will be miserably paying attention to just how pathetic my posture is and how I'm not timing my movements to the music and so on. Once someone becomes super, super, super good at ballet dancing, it's not that they stop paying attention to things. On the contrary, they're paying attention to things that are highly complex. They're jumping in the air, doing some pretty dangerous moves. They're paying attention to other people that are dancing, so it's very complicated. Their experience, however, is completely independent from what they're paying attention at that level. Their experience is, I'm enjoying this. Who knows what they experience, but among other things is this feeling of enjoyment and this feeling of, I just don't experience effort doing this. This is part of this is like the thing I like to do the most or something like that. So that's how it helps, because that distinction that, and by the way, this is interesting in phenomenology in general. So a lot of Husserl is about this border between the conscious integration and what happens before. But even someone like Merleau-Ponty also talks about how what the contents of our mind are related to our actions. And there you can also think, well, yeah, some actions we perform kind of more implicitly, some actions we perform in a way that we're directly involved in the environment and in the encounter is just different from these other forms of engagement. So that's what I would say. Yes.
Maybe a simple question. Are you limiting consciousness to humans or to animals? I'll give you an example.
Mhm.
I read just last week that someone has trained rats to play a game where they tickle rats based on hide and seek. A researcher has done this, and it was very interesting how the rats experienced delight in playing this game, so they were excessively conscious.
Mhm.
And they had learned the strategy of hiding, and in fact, the rats themselves would hide. They were trained to hide. So it's almost like they too have developed what I would consider consciousness. What's your thought along those lines?
I mean, I think first of all, that's one of the main questions, probably one of the hardest questions in this area of research, the evolution of anything, a language, for example. So it's an excellent question, and I certainly don't want to suggest that only humans are conscious. What I want to suggest is that it's useful to think of consciousness and attention as different processes that evolved at some point and that their interaction evolved at some point. But I'm perfectly happy thinking that most mammals are conscious in some way that resembles our own phenomenal consciousness. And that even some sort of alien nervous architectures like the octopus has a certain degree of awareness that we're unfamiliar with but should count as phenomenally conscious. And one of the virtues of Tom Nagel's paper is precisely that he presented this scenario. We said for some individual to be phenomenally conscious, they don't have to resemble our way of being phenomenally conscious. We should be open to the idea that there are truly alien forms of phenomenal consciousness. So I would fully endorse what you're saying, that, as far as I'm concerned, it's an empirical issue. Maybe rats fall closer to how we phenomenally experience things, or maybe not. What I would like to suggest also is that thinking about the bat and the octopus and the rat and bees in terms of what they pay attention to and how that evolved and how alien their phenomenology could be is a better way of tackling this question than just simply imagining what it would be like to be the rat or be the octopus. But I would agree with you that animals, it's kind of really crazy that we think that there's this gigantic divide between ourselves and animals. It's not justified biologically at all. Yes.
Looking at the two pictures here, I don't know if concavity and convexity are crucial to these, but I would think that a lot of complex tasks could well be depicted by merging these two. Because we hear about the 10,000 hour rule, for example. To get good at anything, you have to put in about 10,000 hours. And those would be very frustrating. And continuing on, if you follow your first graph, whereas you spend 1,000, 2,000 frustrating hours, and then you begin to enjoy and acquire some skills, and it would well result in the second graph.
I mean, in principle, I completely agree with what you just said. I don't think this shows just like two completely different ways of doing something. It shows the transition from doing something in a non-expert way and doing it in an expert way. And it could be that the training is frustrating for most people, but what I wanted to highlight is the complexity never goes away. The task is very hard. The task requires very, very difficult, it involves non-trivial abilities to pay attention to very complex things. What changes is your experience of it. So what I was trying to illustrate is here is one phenomenon that is fairly well studied, where phenomenally conscious attention of this type helps you become a true expert, because you're doing complex things for much longer periods of time, which you are enjoying now, rather than suffering through them. But I agree with you that probably as a matter of fact, there's no way to get here without spending massive amounts of time here. You had a question?
I wanted to ask you if machines can pay attention or do whatever you're calling attention. And I think we're going to put the idea of consciousness in machines. leave that for another discussion, but can a machine pay attention?
Very good. Okay, so let's see if I can find this quickly. No, this is not here. There was a paper that I just went through very quickly that is very relevant to your question. Okay. Yeah, this is it. Okay, so it's a very good question, very complicated question. The way Turing thought about this is, so if you have roughly a similar ability that we can all be comfortable with, that should count as intelligence. That's a lot of how these guys are approaching intelligence, sort of roughly an ability, even if it's implemented by a machine, to pay attention to certain objects. My own view is that we're very far from machines to pay attention to things the way we pay attention to. So they may be extensionally equivalent. They may be detecting things roughly the way we're detecting, but not by paying attention to them the way we pay attention to. So we have an architecture that is very selective, and I very quickly can see that there's different objects in this room, and that there's some very specific objects that I'm very specific attuned to, namely you guys. Right? So machines get to this level by being fed tons of data that then, through reinforced learning, allow them to distinguish them, but through very different processes. So I don't think that the abilities are going to be similar, but I think they will get roughly analogous at some point. And these guys are from the Minds, Deep Minds team, Laibo and Hassabis and et al. And what they're doing is they're training their deep learning algorithms with bottom-up attention experiments. So they're training them on multiple object tracking, feature-based attention, spatial navigation, visual acuity, depth recognition, so different tasks that are very well researched in psychophysics. And that's what they say, if these systems are to become visually intelligent, the word we are visually intelligent, they should pass these tasks that we pass very, very easily. And by the way, their systems didn't pass. This is not like, this is Moravich paradox. They can develop the best they can develop the best Go player, but their systems cannot pass basic visual tests. One thing I like about it, I'm very glad you asked this question. One thing I like about this paper is they say in the paper, this is the only scientific way of really studying vision in artificial intelligence. They never mention bottom-up forms of attention. Language plays very little role in the paper, or no role. They never mention phenomenal consciousness or consciousness at all. They just focus on these very bottom-up tasks that happen to be actually complex enough for the systems not to be able to perform at human level. I mean, they're good. They're just not good compared to us. Thanks. Yeah.
Spirituality. Everyone has this term of spirituality. Where does that fit into this?
It actually fits in a. So the way I think, I mean, so the author that talks about this in a lot more detail than anyone else is Nicholas Humphrey. I mean, he started talking about that in this book called Soul Dust. So he worked a lot with chimpanzees. I think he's Diane Fossey's student. And what he says is phenomenal consciousness makes our life beautiful and worth living. It's not because we can know things or pay attention to things or create tools or go to school that phenomenal consciousness is valuable. It's because phenomenal consciousness gives us sort of like an intrinsic motivation to enjoy life and to stay alive. Yes, it can be painful, it can be you can have remorse and all these emotions, but without them, we wouldn't live a very valuable life. And so what he literally claims is, in spiritual traditions, they're very aware of this, that our lives are rich because they're connected to these things that transcend what we can know and the facts about the world. It's not really a fact about the world that our lives are worth living. So that's where he thinks phenomenal consciousness acquires enormous value because this is a claim very difficult to justify just by paying attention to your environment and doing things. Is that helpful? Yeah. Now, there's a connection with spirituality now that I didn't address at all, and I probably shouldn't address at all because it's a much more metaphysical issue, which is like what views about consciousness, the metaphysics of consciousness, would entail that the universe is a very special kind of universe versus just like, 4% matter, antimatter, and then dark energy and dark matter. But, like a beautiful, not only well-designed, well-integrated, but like beautiful, intrinsically valuable universe. That is definitely a spiritual view that some people have that defend panpsychism and other views about consciousness. I don't have a lot to say about that. They're interesting because, again, it's hard to understand what makes the universe special or so unique if you only look at the equations, right? So that's another motivation, different from this one. Another question?
Okay, well, I'd like to thank Carlos for this talk.
Thank you for coming.